The declaration of war was a political sound, made in London. But in the vast, grey expanse of the North Atlantic, that sound transformed. It became the starting pistol for a different kind of conflict, a battle not for territory, but for survival itself. Its outcome would be measured not in miles gained, but in tons delivered. On one side of the ocean stood the United Kingdom, an island fortress with a fatal flaw. It could not feed its people or fuel its war machine from its own soil. Its lifeblood, every shell, every ounce of food, every barrel of oil, had to cross the sea. More than 1 million tons of imports were needed every single week just to keep the nation from starving and to continue the fight. These vital supplies embarked on a perilous journey, primarily from the ports of North America, forming slow-moving convoys that snaked their way towards the British Isles. They were the lifeline. Their safe passage was the single most important strategic objective of the Western Allies. On the other side, in Berlin, the German High Command understood this dependency with perfect clarity. Their strategy was as simple as it was brutal: the tonnage Krieg, the tonnage war. The goal was not to invade Britain directly, but to strangle it. They would tighten a noose around the island nation, sinking merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. If they could sever that transatlantic lifeline, Britain would be brought to its knees, isolated, starved, and forced to sue for peace. The day after Britain declared war, the Allies announced a maritime blockade of Germany. Germany, in turn, would respond with its own, far more deadly, counter-blockade. The stage was set for an epic struggle. The weapons chosen for this initial phase defined its character. The primary instrument of the German Noose was the U-boat. These submarines were not the advanced vessels they would later become. They were small, vulnerable on the surface, and limited in range. But in the early war, they were a terrifyingly effective weapon. Operating alone or in rudimentary groups, they would stalk the sea lanes, their captains peering through periscopes at the endless lines of merchant ships, so vital and so vulnerable. Opposing them was the Royal Navy, a legendary force tasked with an almost impossible mission: to protect thousands of miles of ocean with a finite number of ships. Their primary defense was the convoy system. Dozens of merchant vessels would be grouped together, shepherded by a handful of warships, destroyers, corvettes, and sloops that darted around the periphery like sheepdogs. It was a desperate, numerical gamble. A convoy presented a concentrated target, but it also concentrated its defenses, making it harder for a U-boat to pick off ships with impunity. The first acts of this drama were played out in the frigid waters to the west of the British Isles. A merchant ship, a rust-streaked vessel laden with timber or steel, would be silhouetted against the horizon. Then, the sudden, shocking eruption of a torpedo strike. The geyser of water, the dull thud of the explosion, the terrible shudder that ran through the ship. Within minutes, the vessel would begin to list, its back broken, as the crews scrambled for lifeboats. The U-boat, having delivered its blow, would often slip away unseen, a phantom killer. This was the grim reality of 1939 and 1940. The noose was tightening. The losses began to mount, a steady, grim tally of sunken tonnage. The U-boats were winning the initial rounds, sowing terror and proving that the Atlantic was now a battlefield. The United Kingdom stood alone, its fate balancing on the razor's edge between the lifeline that sustained it and the noose that threatened to extinguish its very will to fight. The survival of a nation, and with it, the future of a free Europe, now depended on the courage of ordinary merchant sailors and the small warships that stood between them and the abyss. The early, solitary successes of the U-boat aces were mere prelude. By 1940, with the fall of France, the strategic map of the Atlantic was redrawn, and the hunter gained a decisive advantage. The U-boats were no longer forced to make the long, dangerous trek from their home ports in Germany. Instead, they found sanctuary in the massive, concrete bunkers of Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle. These formidable pens, immune to Allied bombs, placed the German submarines hundreds of miles closer to their hunting grounds. The Atlantic was suddenly, terrifyingly, within easy reach. It was from these new layers that a new form of oceanic warfare emerged, a tactical revolution masterminded by Admiral Karl Donitz. He understood that a single U-boat, no matter how skilled its crew, was limited. It could sink one, perhaps two ships from a convoy before the escorts would force it down, depth charges tearing through the water. Donnett's vision was of a coordinated pack, a rudal tactic. The wolf pack was born. The tactic was a brutal symphony of communication and destruction. It began not with a sighting, but with a signal. A lone U-boat, designated a Fühlungshalter, contact keeper, would first locate an enemy convoy, often by intercepting radio traffic or simply by being in the right stretch of empty ocean. Its mission was not to attack, but to shadow. From a safe distance, it would transmit a steady stream of encrypted reports to Donnett's headquarters in Lorient, the convoy's course, speed, composition, and escort strength. This stream of data was the pack's lifeblood. In his command center, Donnett's and his staff, the Befehlshaber der U-Boot, BDU, functioned as the brain of the operation. They plotted the convoy's position on large maps and calculated interception courses for every other U-boat within striking distance. Orders crackled through the ether, vectoring in the scattered hunters. Like wolves converging on a herd of caribou, the U-boats would stealthily take up positions ahead of the convoy's path, forming a patrol line across hundreds of miles of ocean. They would wait, submerged by day to avoid detection, their crews straining to hear the approaching thunder of propeller screws. The attack came at night. This was the U-boat's true element. On the surface, the low silhouette of a Type 7C submarine was nearly invisible against the blackness of the sea. Powered by its diesel engines, it could outrun the slower merchant ships and outmaneuver the escorts. The night belonged to the wolf pack. One by one, they would slip inside the convoy's screen, becoming shadows among the shadows. The order, Schiff gefunden, torpedo loss. Ship sighted, torpedo fire, would be given. The first explosion would rip through the night, a flash of orange and a pillar of flame. Then another, and another. Chaos reigned. A merchant ship would erupt, its cargo of aviation fuel or ammunition turning it into a fireball. Another would take a hit amidships, listing violently, its sirens wailing a death knell. The escorts, blind and frantic, would dash about, their ASDIC pings useless against surface targets. The sound of depth charges was a constant, desperate percussion, but they were often dropped at random, a futile attempt to scare off an enemy that was already moving onto its next target. The U-boats, operating with impunity, would weave between the panicked ships, firing torpedoes from point-blank range. The sea became a hellscape of burning oil, sinking wreckage, and the desperate cries of men in the water. For the U-boat crews, these nights were the peak of their deadly profession, but the hours and days between were a test of human endurance. Life inside the steel tube was a claustrophobic nightmare. The air was a thick, foul cocktail of smells, diesel oil, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the acrid scent of battery acid. Condensation dripped constantly from the cold metal hull, soaking everything. Fresh water was a luxury reserved for drinking, personal hygiene was an impossible dream. 50 men lived, worked, and slept in a space no larger than a railway carriage, their world defined by the constant, unnerving creak of the hull under the immense pressure of the deep. They existed in a state of perpetual tension. The cry, alarm, could come at any moment, sending them scrambling to crash dive, the boat angling steeply downward as the depth charges of a patrolling aircraft or destroyer began their dreaded, methodical search. The sound of the charges exploding nearby was not a loud bang, but a massive, concussive thump that slammed against the hull, shaking the boat to its rivets, shattering light bulbs, and threatening to plunge them into a cold, dark grave. They called themselves the Grey Wolves, but they were young men, living in a state of constant adrenaline, their successes measured in tonnage sunk, their lives balanced on the edge of a hydrophone's ping. And in these early years, the tonnage sunk was staggering. The wolf packs operated with such devastating efficiency that they were winning the tonnage war. In the dark days of 1940 and 1941, the grim calculus was simple: the U-boats were sinking ships faster than British shipyards, and even the burgeoning American ones could replace them. The Atlantic was no longer just a battlefield, it was becoming a graveyard, a vast, cold cemetery for steel and the men who sailed it. The Lifeline was fraying, and the Noose, pulled tight by the coordinated jaws of the wolf pack, was threatening to snap it for good. The staggering losses of 1942 made one thing brutally clear: courage and convoy escorts alone could not defeat the wolf packs. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. In response, the conflict transformed. It ceased to be a purely naval engagement and evolved into a monumental struggle of scientific and intellectual wits, a war fought in university laboratories, clandestine decryption centers, and engineering workshops. The Allies, pushed to the brink, began to marshal their greatest weapon, their overwhelming industrial and scientific ingenuity. The first and most critical breakthrough was in the realm of sight. The U-boat's greatest advantage was its invisibility on the surface at night. Early Allied radar, which operated on a meter wavelength, could be detected by German Metox receivers, giving the submarine ample warning to dive. The solution emerged from top-secret British research, the cavity magnetron. This small device generated powerful, focused radio waves on a centimetric wavelength. Its impact was revolutionary. Suddenly, Allied escort vessels and long-range patrol aircraft were equipped with Type 271 radar. This new system could detect something as small as a U-boat's conning tower breaking the surface, even in pitch darkness, dense fog, or rough seas. Crucially, the centimetric radar's signal was so fine it was virtually undetectable by German receivers. The hunter became the hunted. U-boat commanders, who had once felt safe under the cover of night, now found death raining down from a black sky without warning. A Lee light-equipped aircraft would use its radar to guide it in, then flood the surprised U-boat with a blinding searchlight moments before releasing its depth charges. The surface was no longer a sanctuary. But finding the U-boat was only half the battle, destroying it was another. The standard depth charge attack had a fundamental flaw. An escort ship would lose its ASDIC, sonar, contact in the final moments of an attack as it steamed over the submerged target. It had to drop its charges in a pattern where it thought the U-boat was, and the explosions would then churn the water, making further sonar contact impossible. A U-boat captain who kept his nerve could often maneuver away during this blind spot. The answer was the Hedgehog. This was a forward-throwing mortar mounted on the forecastle of an escort. It fired a circular pattern of 24 contact-fused spigot bombs ahead of the ship. The bombs would sink through the water, and they would only explode if they physically struck the U-boat's hull. This eliminated the ASDIC blind spot. The ship could maintain contact throughout the attack. For the U-boat crew, the first sound of an attack was no longer the distant splash of depth charges, but the terrifying, sharp crack of a Hedgehog bomb making contact, a sound that was often the last thing they ever heard. The Germans, reeling from these technological blows, fought back with their own innovations. To counter the radar threat, they developed the snorkel, a retractable mast that allowed a U-boat to run its diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, recharging its batteries without having to fully surface. It was an imperfect solution, it was cumbersome, reduced speed, and made the boat notoriously uncomfortable, but it restored a measure of stealth. They also developed new, faster, and more powerful U-boat types, like the revolutionary Type XXI Electroboot, a submarine designed to operate entirely underwater, rendering radar and many existing Allied tactics obsolete. Fortunately for the Allies, these new boats were plagued by production delays and arrived too late to alter the course of the battle. Yet, the single greatest advantage the Allies gained was one of which the German High Command remained catastrophically unaware: the breaking of the Enigma code. At Bletchley Park in England, a brilliant and secretive group of code breakers, using the pioneering work of Polish mathematicians and the first primitive computers, labored to decipher the encrypted radio traffic of the German Navy. The naval Enigma, with its extra rotors, was the most complex of all, and periods of blackout, when the codes could not be read, were times of terrible loss for the convoys. But when the code breakers succeeded, the entire North Atlantic became, for Allied command, a transparent battlefield. They could read Donnett's orders to his wolf packs. They knew the positions of the U-boat patrol lines, their supply points, and their intended targets. This priceless intelligence, known as Ultra, allowed the Admiralty to route convoys around known U-boat concentrations, guiding them through safe gaps in the German patrols. The slow, vulnerable merchant ships were no longer blind cattle being herded into an ambush, they were now being stealthily guided through a minefield whose locations were known. The U-boat crews, waiting for days in the freezing emptiness, would report no contact, baffled by the convoys' seemingly clairvoyant ability to avoid them. The tide was turning. The combination of centimetric radar, the Hedgehog, long-range aircraft closing the mid-Atlantic air gap, and the supreme advantage of ultra-intelligence created a synergistic effect. The ocean, once a domain of fear and the unknown for the Allies, was becoming a controlled, charted space. For the U-boat crews, the Atlantic was shrinking, becoming a deadly hunting ground where they were now the prey, stalked by an enemy who could see in the dark and read their every move. The technological pendulum had swung decisively, setting the stage for the brutal climax of the campaign. The spring of 1943 brought the cold, grey Atlantic to a fulcrum. For over 3 years, the battle had surged back and forth, a bloody pendulum swing of tactical innovation and raw attrition. But by May, all the threads of the Allied effort, the technology, the intelligence, the training, and the industrial might, converged into a single, unbreakable rope. For the U-boats, it was a rope destined for a noose. The month would become seared into the memory of the Kriegsmarine as Black May, the catastrophic turning point where the hunter was systematically and relentlessly broken. The stage was set in the mid-Atlantic, the void once known as the Black Pit, where land-based air cover could not reach. Here, Admiral Donitz had massed over 60 U-boats in powerful wolf packs with names like Drossel and Amsel, confident they could overwhelm any convoy defense. They were met by a new kind of adversary, the dedicated support groups. These were not the weary, scattered escorts of 1941. They were flotillers of modern, fast destroyers and frigates, freed from direct convoy duty to act as hunter-killer teams. Their sole purpose was to find U-boats and destroy them. The first layer of defense was now in the air. Very long-range, VLR, Liberator bombers, finally equipped with additional fuel tanks, flew from both sides of the Atlantic, closing the air gap forever. Their presence was constant and terrifying. A U-boat lookout's cry of Flieger was no longer occasional alarm but a recurring nightmare. These aircraft were armed with the new centimetric radar, Lee lights, depth charges, and the fearsome Hedgehog-like rockets. They could detect a U-boat on the surface, attack it before it could fully dive, or simply force it to submerge, rendering it slow, blind, and unable to intercept the convoy. The most potent symbol of this new Allied dominance was the arrival of the escort carrier groups. These small, agile aircraft carriers, built on merchant hulls, sailed right with the convoys. They brought their own air cover with them, a moving pocket of air power that could dominate the skies for hundreds of miles around. A U-boat commander, having carefully maneuvered into an attack position, would now see not just the silhouettes of merchant ships, but the menacing profile of a small flight deck launching swordfish biplanes or Wildcat fighters armed with depth charges. The element of surprise, the U-boat's greatest weapon, was utterly neutralized. The battle for convoy ONS-5 in the first week of May became the microcosm of the entire campaign. A slow, westbound convoy of 43 ships was targeted by a wolf pack of over 50 U-boats. What followed was a brutal, week-long running fight in atrocious weather. Initially, it seemed like a classic U-boat victory, with a dozen merchantmen sunk. But the escorts, coordinated by brilliant command and the invisible hand of ultra-intelligence, which revealed the German positions, fought back with a ferocity the U-boats had never before encountered. They used HF, DF to fix the locations of shadowing U-boats and hunted them down relentlessly. In the fog and chaos, the escorts turned the tables, sinking U-boat after U-boat in close quarters, violent actions. The climax came as the convoy moved into the range of Allied air cover. VLR Liberators from Iceland and Newfoundland pounced on their waiting wolf packs. The U-boats were systematically located, harassed, and sunk. They could not surface to recharge their batteries, they could not communicate, and they could not attack. The pack was scattered and decimated. By the time the battle was over, the Germans had sunk 13 merchant ships, a painful loss, but a Pyrrhic victory. The cost was the destruction of 7 U-boats and severe damage to many more, a loss rate that was utterly unsustainable. The pattern repeated itself throughout the month. Every time a wolf pack formed, it was met by a wall of escorts and a curtain of air power. The statistics from Black May tell the story of a force in its death throes. The Allies sank 41 U-boats in the Atlantic in a single month, a staggering 30% of the entire operational U-boat fleet. The toll on experienced crews was devastating. Thousands of the Kriegsmarine's best men were lost to the deep. More terrifying for Donitz was the plummeting exchange rate. The U-boats were now sinking less than one merchant ship for every submarine lost. The fundamental math of the tonnage war had been inverted. The psychological impact was as profound as the material loss. The confidence of the U-boat arm, once unshakable, shattered. The ocean, once their hunting ground, had become a tomb. Patrols became suicide missions. The crews, who had once sailed with the swagger of aces, now departed with a sense of grim foreboding. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donitz, facing the annihilation of his command, made the only decision he could. He withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The order was a tacit admission of defeat. The silence that followed was palpable. For the first time since 1939, the sea lanes across the Atlantic were secure. The Lifeline was not just holding, it was thriving. The massive, unchecked buildup of American men and equipment in Britain for the invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, could now begin in earnest. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the Allies had gained undeniable, permanent control of the ocean. The threat of the U-boat would persist, but it was now a managed threat, a nuisance rather than an existential danger. The victory won in the cruel waters of Black May was the silent, unsung prerequisite for D-Day and the liberation of a continent. The silence that settled over the North Atlantic convoy routes after Black May was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a battlefield after the decisive engagement has been won. The German withdrawal was a strategic admission of defeat. The tonnage war, the central objective of the Kriegsmarine for nearly 4 years, had failed. The Lifeline had held. Yet, to label the outcome a victory feels inadequate, for it was a triumph purchased at a price so staggering it defies comprehension. The Battle of the Atlantic was a strategic victory for the Allies, but it was a victory that demanded a pound of flesh from every nation involved, paid in steel, blood, and terror. The raw numbers alone are numbing. Stretching from the icy waters off Newfoundland to the coastal approaches of Liverpool, the seabed became a necropolis for ships. Over 3,500 Allied and neutral merchant vessels were sent to the bottom, their holds filled with the very cargo meant to sustain a war effort and feed a populace. These were not just anonymous hulls, they were floating cities of industry, carrying tanks, aircraft, wheat, steel, and fuel. Alongside them, 175 warships, from mighty aircraft carriers and sleek destroyers to the small, brave corvettes that had borne the brunt of the fighting, rest in the deep, their crews entombed within. On the other side, the German U-boat arm was systematically annihilated. Of the 1,170 U-boats commissioned during the war, 783 were destroyed, a loss rate of over 65%. This figure represents more than just lost hardware, it signifies the virtual extinction of an entire generation of highly trained submariners. Approximately 30,000 of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat fleet never returned, the highest casualty rate of any service in any armed force during the war. They died in the crushing darkness, their boats torn apart by depth charges or shattered by hedgehog bombs. For every U-boat that slipped back into its concrete pen in France, flying its victory pennants, 3 others never made the return journey. This colossal consumption of resources defined the campaign for Germany. The Rhine invested more money, material, and scientific effort into its U-boat fleet and other naval vessels than into all of its army's tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces combined. It was a monumental strategic diversion, a drain on the German war economy that crippled its ability to equip its land forces adequately on the eastern and western fronts. The Atlantic was a bottomless pit into which German industrial might was poured, for ultimately no gain. Yet, behind these vast, impersonal statistics lies the human truth of the battle, a truth best understood not by admirals, but by the men who lived it. Winston Churchill, who guided Britain through its darkest hour, later wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." This was not the fear of invasion, which carried the pageantry of battle, but a deeper, more insidious dread, the fear of slow, silent strangulation. It was the understanding that courage on the battlefield could be rendered meaningless if the supplies never arrived. The victory, therefore, was not won by admirals alone. It was forged in the shipyards of Glasgow and Baltimore, where workers labored around the clock to replace the lost tonnage faster than the U-boats could sink it. It was conceived in the laboratories and at Bletchley Park, where scientists and code breakers gave the escorts eyes and ears. It was executed by the young sailors on the escort ships, who endured the brutal weather and the terrifying wait for the Aztec ping, their nerves frayed by the relentless tension. But above all, the battle was won by the most unsung heroes of the war, the merchant sailors. They were not trained warriors. They were civilians, cooks, engineers, radio operators, and deckhands from Britain, Canada, the United States, Norway, and a dozen other nations. They volunteered, voyage after voyage, to cross an ocean they knew was infested with a silent, ruthless enemy. They sailed in slow, vulnerable vessels, their ships little more than floating bombs if a torpedo hit their cargo of fuel or ammunition. They faced the prospect of a violent end in the freezing water, or a slow death adrift in a lifeboat, with only the clothes on their backs. There were no medals for a successful crossing, only the grim expectation of having to do it all over again. Their courage was not the explosive courage of the charge, but the enduring, stubborn courage of the supply line, the will to keep going. The Battle of the Atlantic secured the necessary precondition for the liberation of Europe. The D-Day landings, the Great Crusade, would have been impossible without the safe passage of the millions of men and the mountains of material that assembled in Britain. It was a victory of collective effort, of industrial might over tactical brilliance, of stubborn resilience over predatory efficiency. When the final accounting was done, the cost was almost beyond measure, but the prize was the future of freedom itself. The Atlantic, once a graveyard, became a highway to victory, its waters a permanent memorial to the tens of thousands on both sides who met their end in its cold, unforgiving embrace.